What's going on, everybody? Andrew Hobner here with No Cap Space, coming to you live from my closet. Sometimes you just got to do what you got to do to get the audio quality you want to get. This is the start of an exciting new project that will be broadcast live from my closet. It is called the Legendarium. It is a series of historical profiles taking you into the minds of those who helped pave the foundation for the sport that we see experiencing such an explosive growth today. I'll give you a bit of backstory on why we did this, and then we'll get right into our first installment. There's so many new fans of the game these days, right? And every discussion that we've had with people has primarily been about what is the adequate amount of history that a new fan needs to know to be able to engage in good faith with people about women's basketball and the merits of where certain people stand in a GOAT conversation, for instance, right? And as we looked back on it, the five of us at NCS, we realized that we've, as a whole, longtime media people within the W and longtime fans of the W, we've generally done a pretty poor job of caretaking and stewarding our own history. There's a lot of women in this game that have massive contributions to it that we just don't straight up talk a lot about, programs that we don't talk a lot about. And if we're going to ask new fans to know the history and be involved in the history of this game, we need to make it easier and more accessible for people to know the history. I mean, even in this experience of trying to learn for myself to get background for these interviews, you got to really look to find some of the histories, right? We know Tennessee, we know UConn, but do you know Delta State? Do you know Wayland Baptist? Do you know Rutgers? Do you know Long Beach State and the early USC teams and, the 78 UCLA team, for instance? Like, those squads are vital to the history of this sport, and yet we do not talk about them nearly enough in the way that we need to or should. And so that is the impetus for this project. And what we wanted to do for people is give them an opportunity to really see and understand this game and the history and the people that built it. So without further ado, I mean, I guess we can kind of jump right in. This is the very first installment of the Legendarium video essays. You can find these on our Substack. The written profiles go out every other Wednesday, starting July 10th, which was this past Wednesday, and then a podcast on Thursday, a video essay that comes out on Friday. So we hope you guys really enjoy it, and let's jump right in to our very first installment, which examines one of the biggest splits in women's basketball that got us to a place where we are today. So it's 1982, and something is happening in women's basketball that has never happened before. On a spring Sunday, Louisiana Tech and Cheney State are playing for the first NCAA championship, but a couple of states over, in the Palestra in Philadelphia, a second national championship game was just tipping off. Rutgers pulled off one of the biggest upsets in early women's hoops history, beating previously undefeated Texas and winning the last national title. Now, the Scarlet Knights are called the Forgotten Champions to some, but for those that remember an era that was governed by women and for women, they are known as the last champions. So in 1981, women's basketball was about to transition from one era into another. Since Title IX was introduced, the sport was governed by the Association for Intercollegiate Athletics for Women. It was called the AIAW. Some of the greatest players and coaches in women's basketball history got their start during this time, and a few of the programs you may recognize right now. It's Texas and Tennessee and USC and Maryland and UCLA, but the others you'll be learning about through this profile series. Your Immaculatas, your Wayland Baptists, your Delta States. It was around this time that Rutgers decided that they wanted to compete with the best, so they went down to Philly and they found Teresa Grenz, who was a three-time national champion from Immaculata as a player, who was coaching at St. Joe's, and they decided that they would make her the first full-time head women's basketball coach in sports history. Chris Daly, who is the 11-time national champion assistant coach at UConn, who has sat with Gino Wariema through every single iteration of this dynasty, played for Teresa at Rutgers.
I didn't realize it when I was in college and in the process, but she wasn't much older than we were. So I don't think that there was that view of Teresa as a coach. I had that view of her as a player because I remember as a high school player, we used to go to Westchester to see a game once a year or to Immaculata.
So pulling from New Jersey and the Catholic League in Philadelphia, Rutgers was a team in her image, scrappy, competitive, and that came up on the blacktops playing 5-on-5 with the guys. And let's just say, in order to stay on the court, you had to be tough.
You had to create a lot of your own competition, whether it's swimming in the pool, whatever it was, there was competition, and it was competition with my brothers. It was competition with the guys in the neighborhood.
Each year, the Knights were one of the best teams in the country. They played in the Orange Bowl against Kansas, and former NCAA career scoring leader Lynette Woodard. Rutgers guard Mary Coyle matched up every year against a guard from Ruston, Louisiana by the name of Kim Mulkey, a couple of times in Madison Square Garden.
We can laugh about it now. I mean, I think she'll tell people I was the meanest son of a bitch she ever played against. And I was like, yeah, no prize either, so.
So they'd play UCLA and Long Beach, but from 1979 to 1981, they'd run up on a team in the round of 16 in the AIAW National Tournament that usually would get the better of them.
A lot of times you'll hear teams tell that story that they had this great year on the heels of having a disappointing year and then figuring out what they needed to do and what needed to be different in order to have the success that they then went on to have.
So heading into the 1982 season, things had changed significantly in the landscape of women's basketball. At a convention in Miami, the NCAA and its member schools were getting ready for a vote on whether or not to hold championship events for women's sports, which included basketball. So the battle lines are drawn. Texas, which was an early adopter of the AIAW and one of the foundational members of the organization, really led the charge along with Iowa's legendary athletic director Christine Grant to keep it all in-house so that women continued to govern sports for women. But in their eyes, it would keep them insulated from making the mistakes that they thought the men had made with the governance of the NCAA. And at the time, the AIW could kind of stand on its own. The numbers are lost in time, but the story is that the 1980 AIAW Women's Basketball Tournament actually outdrew the NBA playoffs in terms of TV ratings. NBC had a TV deal to broadcast the title game. It was $250,000 for a game each year. That's about $1 million per game today. And to some of the powers that be, they didn't think they needed the NCAA all that much. So it made for really weird allies. The legendary Arkansas football coach Frank Broyles was against the merger, and a lot of the women's administrators believed that he did it because he didn't want women's sports cutting into the football budget, but they didn't care. Any bedfellow was a good one here. So the vote came, and then a recount came. It was 128 to 127. The AIAW won and kept its governance until they didn't. So the legend goes that the NCAA got the representative from the University of California, Berkeley to introduce a motion to reconsider. The NCAA then came in and promised things. They could subsidize team travel to the NCAAs, and if you wanted to make women's basketball a part of the NCAA, then your school wouldn't have to pay an additional due to get them in the way you had to do with some other sports. So for years, teams had to pay their own way to go to the AIAW National Tournament, whether it was by bus or by plane. And so for people, this was a big deal. And the wind shifted, the tide turned, and after the motion to reconsider was passed, the votes came in, and then boom, the NCAA won the vote. So NBC pulled out of their broadcast deal because Tennessee and Louisiana Tech and Old Dominion are out of the AIAW National Tournament. So that pulled all the TV revenue away from the league. So 1982 would be the last championship of an era that built the game that we know today before the NCAA came and took it over.
It never felt like we weren't playing in a meaningful championship. Kind of the way we thought any championship we were in made it meaningful.
Yeah.
You don't know any better because you're a college kid. You're just trying to win.
So while the 1982 NCAA championship was televised, the AIAW game in the Palestra was not. But the teams involved in the championship were no pushovers. Rutgers earlier that year had beaten Cheyney State, who would later be in that NCAA title game, and Texas was number 5 in the country and undefeated going into the AIAW championship. Chris Daly remembers seeing the Longhorns for the very first time.
You would have had to live under a rock not to know that Texas was undefeated and recognize some of the names of their players. And you could tell that they had a long history of doing things a certain way. They came in dressed a certain way. The Louisiana Tech was the same way.
Some felt it would be Texas's game to lose, but the Scarlet Knights had some other plans. Despite being down 5 at half, Rutgers stormed back, and when the final buzzer sounded, the Scarlet Knights were indeed the last champions.
It's one of those games that I think everybody did a little something.
Mhm.
June's past, Terry started out, she didn't have one of her best games, but gave us what we needed at the time.
The area really celebrated it. The university, we rang the old Queen's Bell, and believe that's only reserved for national champions, possibly Olympic champions. Not 100% sure, but that was a really dynamite moment.
They may not have known it at the time, but that would be the swan song of the AIAW. The very next year, the NCAA came in and invited all of the teams to the tournament, and those were all the teams that could stay Division I, right? So Rutgers and them decided, yeah, all right, it's time to go. While legendary programs like Immaculata, Delta State, Wayland Baptist, they ended up dropping down to Division II or III and kind of got lost to history a bit. Now, Rutgers under Teresa Grenz continued to shine. They had a pair of Elite Eight appearances in the 80s, and then when C. Vivian Stringer took over in the 90s, they made a national championship. But the legacy of those forgotten champions, those last champions, continues to echo throughout the game today. Mary Coyle, the diminutive guard who's viewed by many as one of the best of the era, is now one of the greatest high school basketball coaches in New Jersey history. June Olkowski, who was widely regarded as one of the best players in the nation at the time, is the only head coach to never have a losing season with Butler women's basketball. Teresa Grenz, of course, went on to the Hall of Fame for her work as a coach and a player. She built the Illinois women's basketball program. Pat Coyle played for the New York Liberty, then eventually coached the team. And Chris Daly tries to educate her next generation of UConn stars, from Brianna Stewart to Paige Beckers, about those that paved the way for them in the game.
It's a little easier to do it because when you do something great, it's all over social media, it's all over everything. And back then, people did it more because it was the right thing to do. And it was to give women and girls an opportunity to compete and to compete at a high level. So I still try to work with our players now, not only to know the history of UConn and who came before them, but the history of women's basketball.
And that right there is the legacy of the last champions, the standard bearers for the first era to put women's basketball on the map, and one that's going to live in the legendarium of basketball forever. That's our first installment. There's another one coming in 2 weeks, and then 2 weeks after that, and 2 weeks after that. We hope you guys stay with us on the journey and learn a little something about those that came before and those that built the game and are now getting to see Caitlin Clark and Angel Reese and Asia and Stewie and Sabrina all pick up the baton and take it in to the next era, along with the Paige Beckerses and the Juju Watkins, Mylasia Fulwileys of the world. So we hope you stay on this journey with us. As always, subscribe to our Substack to read the full profiles, all of the information and all of the content you get into your email the second it goes up. So that's nocapspace.substack.com. You can follow and subscribe here on YouTube. And then, of course, everything else on our social media pages you can find right down in our bio there. Stick with us, of course. We got lives and post games, playbacks, interviews coming up. We got some good ones and luxury tax coming up as well. That's a podcast you can subscribe to. And there's so much more coming. So hang with us, because No Cap Space is not slowing down. We are your place for everything, and we hope to see you guys again soon. And until then, man, respect the history, give the flowers, and enjoy the women's basketball, because the basketball, folks, is very, very good.